You all look beautiful. You all look very smart.
You're live.
Hi, this is Rob Greene, and this is QuaranCon, and this is the What Does Science Fiction and Fantasy Get Away With? What does fantasy get away with that science fiction does not? I apologize. My name is Rob Greene. I woke up a little hoarse this morning, so if I sound a little hoarse, I apologize. I'm supposed to say something about the book sale. Go to the book sale and buy books. But for now, we've got these fantastic people here to talk to you about the differences in this genre. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I'm going to call them out by name and give them about 20 seconds to give them their name and flog whatever they want to flog. I'm going to start with Khan because he's on my left.
Hi, I'm Wong, and I am the author of The Circus Infinite, which is out now from Angry Robot Books. It's my debut, and it's been out just for about a month now. And it's a space fantasy, so apropos of this topic. And that's all I'll say at the moment.
All right. Neil, you want to go?
All right, so my name's Neil Williamson. 20 minutes, is it? So I was born. No, 20 seconds. I'm a writer from Glasgow in Scotland. I write both fantasy and science fiction. The thing I'm flogging is the gorgeous Queen of Clouds, which I'm very proud of. It came out last week. And we're doing a bit of promo for it, some lunches. It's all been very good. And I'm really excited about this panel. It's going to be really good.
Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm sure I won't grab a book because I'll knock something over. I'm a London-based author, and I'll talk to you about my YouTube channel. It's Science and Fantasy, where I explore all sorts of very strange topics like the evolution of dragons and how magic can actually be happening through like the inheritance, how you could make something like that happen genetically speaking. And I have a background in neuroscience, so I'm trying to bring the science to fantasy.
All right, Patrick?
Hi, I'm Patrick LeClerc. I'm an author of, I write science fiction, fantasy throughout the speculative fiction genres. So I've done a little bit of all of it. My latest book that I'm flogging is The Beckoning Void, which is a swashbuckling action adventure steampunk horror, because that's the most cool words I could stuff in a description. So I stopped there. I've also written some science fiction. I did a military science fiction. So I've done a little bit of both, which is why I'm interested in this topic. And my day job, I'm a paramedic. So that's the other end of it. I'm happy to be here.
Well, my name is Rob Greene. I write as R.W.W. Greene because it's easier to Google. Since the pandemic began, I've put out 2 books with one more coming out in May. This is The Light Years, which is science fantasy-ish. This is 25 to Life, which I think is science fiction. And this is the one coming out in May, and I think this is science fantasy. And hopefully I can get a chance to explain what and why that is. An interesting thing happened when we opened the Discord. The question here is, what does fantasy get away with that science fiction does not? And one of our panelists wrote down nothing that doesn't get away with. But on the other hand, I was on the swearing panel yesterday, and our moderator made a comment about how it would be possible to pull a sword out of your ass and just say, it's magic, as long as you could set up earlier in the book that you can make a bag of holding out of almost everything, right? So on that, either fantasy gets away with nothing that science fiction does, or fantasy gets away with a lot more. And I was thinking about this in terms of if you look at the word fantasy and how it's modified, you've got space fantasy, science fantasy, urban fantasy, epic fantasy, historical fantasy. And then you look how science fiction is modified. Science fiction is modified as hard or soft. So I'd like to start with this kind of a question across the board. What's the difference between science fiction and fantasy?
Rockets and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. Rockets in one, dragons in the other one. No, they're both so wide. It's really tough to draw a bright line, I think. And there's a lot of overlap. it all falls under speculative fiction. We're all asking what if. I think some things are definitely science fiction, some things are definitely fantasy, but there's a lot of mushy middle ground.
Yeah, the most rigid subsets of sci-fi to me are what is referred to as hard science fiction, and I think also military. Those, to me, are the subgenres that like are most rooted in actual reality and real physics, and are extrapolating from existing science, and that adherence to at least what's theoretically possible are kind of defining factors for those. But I describe what I am currently writing as space fantasy, which to me is more of a subset of sci-fi than of fantasy, but it is kind of both, I guess. But yeah, so I think if you're working in a setting that's real world based, that that the science in your sci-fi has to be much more rigorous.
Yeah, can I ask you a question? Why you opted for space fantasy as opposed to the broader science fiction?
Well, so because my story is set in outer space, there's a lot of aliens. There's different alien species. There's interstellar travel that's facilitated by wormholes. And there are people with powers, which is kind of like magic, but it's like a science fictional way. So, so that's mostly why is really the setting, and that it's different aliens as opposed to elves and dwarves and
yeah, I get that. I get frustrated by these kind of more granular labels because I think sometimes you're chasing, not you specifically, but people are chasing the ability to describe one particular thing, and it doesn't always work. I mean, obviously that sounds like it works for you, but I would have been quite happy personally with science fiction. That because I know what there's a broad label: science fiction, spaceships, get that, or future stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is not a criticism. I just think it's interesting the way people are choosing different words now to market their.
Well, it's a little bit too about managing reader expectations. I don't want to say my book is strictly science fiction, and then have somebody be like, aliens, psychic powers, what? This isn't realistic. I mean, so I kind of want to state at the outset, this is this kind of sci-fi.
I think it's interesting. Maybe we can loop around to that later on. But sorry for digressing. I just find it interesting.
Rachel, I feel you're bursting.
No, I think he's hit on a great point. It's all about reader expectation, isn't it? That's why, I frequently get called a bit of an anarchist when it comes to my view on what is sci-fi and what is fantasy. And, maybe that's because I'm reading scientific papers about the things that we're doing now in science that, they make what used to be considered magical things possible. We're talking about neural linking into our brains, and that I cannot for the life of me remember, but there's a fantastic quote by an author, and I'm going to kick myself about this later, who said that basically magic can often be types of technology that we just don't understand. To me, my computer is blimmin' magic because I have no idea how it actually works. So I just think that the actual definition of sci-fi and fantasy is entirely at this point dependent on as a marketing tool to try and help readers understand where their books are. But I don't think it's really going to apply, especially as we move forward into a world where you're going to have virtual realities and people spending most of their days in very fantastical settings that have been made possible by technology. I'm like, what on earth are you going to call those? Anarchist.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, moving into the future when we actually have the things that we used to call science fiction as reality, what science fiction? What does science fiction mean in that context, and what does fantasy mean in that context? It's a really interesting question. This kind of going back to sort of the split, but I think it's interesting. I think things have moved a lot in the last 50 to 70 years. At one point, someone might have said that science fiction is limited by what's possible in this world and in this universe, and science and fantasy is limited by what you can imagine. And I think it really depends on the story you're trying to tell, as well as the people you're trying to market it to.
Well, who's to say what's possible? And
that's it, isn't it? Yeah.
The boundaries of possibility are forever changing, and we don't know what will be possible in the future. So I think it's a bit of a strong statement, really, to say that one thing is definitely impossible.
I totally agree, especially with space science. We don't know all the stuff. We don't know. There's much more that we don't know than there is that we do know. So, yeah.
One of the things I brought up in the Discord is that what was once science fiction becomes science fantasy. All the stories about the canals of Mars and Bradbury stuff about people landing on Mars and finding 1920s cities and things like that. Stuff that was considered sci-fi. Even Bradbury himself, in his later years, only said he only wrote one science fiction story, and the rest was science fantasy. Which I found kind of interesting, and I think the one he was referring to was the one with the house in the atomic war. The house that survived. Siri screaming out into the abyss. I guess a question I would ask then is, if you look at science fiction is generally considered to be aspirational. If you watch Star Trek, you wanted to be an astronaut. If you read science fiction, you want to be a programmer or something like that. What does fantasy have that is equivalent to that?
Which subgenre?
Yeah, so I'm just asking. So is there a fantasy subgenre that makes me want to be an elf, or makes me want to be? Is there something that I can aspire to within the fantasy genre that is actually real?
I mean,
fantasy characters show up as an example, as an example to aspire to. Not necessarily that I'm going to be a knight, but you may look at that what they embody, and like Aragorn can be an example of how to be. It's unlikely that I'm going to be a ranger fighting orcs out in Mirkwood. That's less likely, but. So I think that there's definitely that element of fantasy and science fiction give us heroes and archetypes that we can look up to and that we can kind of map onto our lives. And traditionally, science fiction was more, we're really writing about today. We're just disguising it as a story. That kind of is, I don't know that that's always true anymore, but that was always kind of a science fiction mentality, whereas fantasy could be more of an invented story. But I think they both work on that. I think they're much more similar than they are different. I think it's just really splitting hairs with definitions.
I think you've made a really interesting point there, and because the kind of stories that I write are about concepts. Hi Joyce, we're glad you made it. They're the kind of concepts that we're facing in every day, and that have traditionally been more sci-fi in the approach to tackle them. So, for example, I wrote about memory thieves. Now, dementia, the loss of memory, how memory is linked to identity, been tackled in sci-fi for years. Less so as a concept, in fantasy, about questioning, how your memories define who you are as a person. But just because it hasn't traditionally been done, I don't think that means that it can't be done. I think it's just that sci-fi has traditionally taken the lead there, but I think we're starting to see more authors decide that actually you can do with magic what you can do with technology, which is ask those questions. And so again, it's breaking down the genres even more.
Can you do a Jeremiah, like the dangers of technology or the dangers of messing around with vaccines? Can you do that in a fantasy setting and make it believable?
Why not? I mean, you can do dangers of technology into yourself. So you can ask the question of addiction, or the dangers of, say, you're using magic. Well, is that magic polluting the atmosphere? Is it draining resources from other environments? All those questions that we see that are affecting our lives in everyday now, with God knows what coming to us in the future. You can put a fantasy magical spin on them.
What are
Lord of the
vaccines if
Rings,
not
I think
potions?
there's a huge. I'm sorry.
No, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, no, there's an enormous thread of that if you look through Lord of the Rings. The idea of addiction, the idea of power corrupting you, of becoming dependent on the power, and of the ways that different characters harness that. We have Galadriel, who's using her power to preserve, and Saruman, who's using his power to kind of break things. And that, I wouldn't say it's an allegory, but it definitely maps onto, are we destroying our environment in order to gain this power?
That was That was Tolkien when he wrote the whole metaphor behind Lord of the Rings, and the Shire versus Mordor was the industrialization. And that's, again, a similar theme that you see tackled in sci-fi.
Colin, what were you going to say?
Oh, it was just a silly quip that what are vaccines, but not, if not potions? I mean,
Not so silly.
So go ahead, sorry.
No, just what Rachel was just saying made me like kind of raise the question in my head if nowadays, if the difference between fantasy and sci-fi isn't really just a matter of aesthetics. And what kind of setting are you in?
But then you get into the trouble of the science fantasy, like the Marvel universe, which is, it's in a futuristic style setting, but it's magic. I'm like, I don't even want to go there with that label.
Well, but other people have, other people have already said that Star Wars is science fantasy. It's got, it's got hyper speed. It's got, robots or AIs that are slaves. It's got, aliens. It's got planets that have the same environment over the entire planet. It's got, gravity that seems to be about the same everywhere you go. It's got laser swords. It's got the Force. If that's not science fantasy, what is science fantasy?
That's a great example. And that comes from, I think, it's really a mashup of everything George Lucas thought was awesome. Mm-hmm. It's a cowboy, samurai, wizard, fantasy, Flash Gordon, just pile it all together. We're going to have some World War II dogfights because they were awesome, and some samurais that we're going to reskin as Jedi because they were awesome. And so I think he wound up with all these diverse elements and put it in an environment, and it made us care about the environment enough that we accept it. It's not necessarily, doesn't map onto our understanding of physics, but we want to believe in it because we spent enough time with it and it spoke to something in us. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why it's been so enduring.
So would you call that science fiction now, though? If the genres have come so close together that they are now one, and that the differences are only trappings, then is Star Wars now science fiction?
Is it both?
Is it both?
Yeah, isn't that what we're saying? That instead of there being two separate, that they've merged, and that in Star Wars is smack bang in the middle, so it is both. Hence why we're having such a problem.
Is it a problem? I don't think it's a problem. I think it's fine if Star Wars is both, and there's massive overlap. There are some things that I think will always just be fantasy, and some things will so you, Patrick, that was talking about hard science fiction, or was it Rob? I can't remember now. It was Rob at the beginning, yeah, talking about the classifications of science fiction and hard science fiction. I think most people would have a hard job, a difficult job classifying that as fantasy or framing that as fantasy. I think what's interesting about when you come to write these genres is no matter how rigorous you are in setting it up, no matter how rigorous you are in making sure you get the science right for your hard science fiction, or making sure your magic system is rigorous in your fantasy, and your flights of fantasy are real flights of fantasy, and your fantasy side of things, there's always going to be things that you're fudging. There's always going to be little things somewhere along the line that aren't quite right, but they make the story better. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, even hard science fiction is going to have things that aren't necessarily true in them. But as long as, I think, Can, you mentioned this in the pre-chat, and I really agreed with it. As long as you set up the parameters of the way the world works in whatever genre you're writing in, and make it internally consistent throughout, then the reader's going to go with you. They're going to be on board. They're going to suspend their disbelief from the highest yardarm and just enjoy it until the moment where you drop the ball and break your own rules. So going back to what Rachel was saying, does it matter which one you're writing? Are they the same? In the end, it's all stories. In the end, it's all stories, and you can paint it up whichever way you want to paint it up. I don't think I really believe there's a fundamental particle of science fiction story and a fundamental particle of fantasy story.
Yeah, I feel like it's not a challenge for readers and writers, but it is for marketing people.
Yeah.
No, that is their job.
I think
it depends in part on whether you have a scientific mind and whether you can think in terms of the science explaining.
That's why I think that there's Pam said in the chat that someone should draw a Venn diagram, and that got me thinking that if you think of it like a spectrum, and you have sci-fi on one end, fantasy on the other, science fantasy here, connecting them, which is, let's face it, fantasy, emotional storytelling plot device, but in a more science fiction-y setting. And then we're missing the fourth quadrant of the Venn diagram then, aren't we? Which is the scientific intention, the more Ray Bradbury style, but in a fantasy setting. So I think that we're going to have the emergence of that fourth subgenre really as time goes on.
I think people are doing that, Rachel. I think it exists. I do it a bit in my novels. It's kind of what I enjoy doing.
Totally.
Yeah,
no, I totally agree. It's part of where I go, but I mean, I'm in self-publishing, so I'm looking at the marketing end, and it's quite hard to label your books in that sense. And I'm seeing it starting to emerge. That's why I love talking about it on my channel. I've got lots of authors who are writing their books who are talking about, how they have scientist main characters. They're looking at, they've got someone who's like a botanist as the main character of their fantasy story. I'm like, I love this. This is great. Yeah. And so I think this is going to be a growing trend.
Yeah, especially if they're set, for instance, kind of early Victorian kind of times. They're great. Kind of, I guess you used to call them scientific romances, didn't you? But yeah, exactly. Excellent.
See, I'm the moderator, so I shouldn't have strong opinions, but I'm going to offer a strong opinion, in that, the way I look at it, the more you have to hand wave, the more you end up on the fantasy side. So I look at something like Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future, which is a book I loved, which is about, there's a big disaster, 150 million people are killed like next year. And that sets off a political maneuvering in the United Nations, which creates this ministry which is supposed to help us with the climate. And they come up with solutions to the climate problem. The only part to me, because he got the science right, the only part to me that he had to hand wave was human nature. So it was the soft sciences that he had to hand wave, like psychology and sociology. And I think Neil brought up solar punk. Solar punk is this thing that's happening, this kind of hopeful thing. And the science is right, but the social science, everybody's hand waving, like the government's going to be fine. And, this is not the droid you're looking for. And this is not, whatever. So I tend to think that anytime you have to hand wave, it's a slippery slope toward the dark side of fantasy. And not the dark side, I like fantasy too, but that's just kind of where I'm coming from.
I definitely agree with that. I think it's like I said, it all falls under speculative fiction. You can do anything you can, but you have to sell the audience on it. And you can sell a fantasy audience on, this is magic. This was created by the gods. This was, and they'll accept that. This is the prophecy. He's the chosen one. Why? Because it's the prophecy. If you want to do that in science fiction and sell it as traditional, harder science fiction, you have to explain it a little better. And there's cheats, there's workarounds. I did a military science fiction, and my knowledge of science outside of medicine is, I'm going to say, rudimentary at best, but I just made my point of view character an infantryman. And I know from experience that we don't have to understand how the stuff works. We just have to understand how to use it. So he doesn't have to know why the ship drive works. He knows what it does. He knows that, okay, this thing's going to happen. I have to brace. I have to understand it. But you can handwave a lot by picking a character who doesn't fully understand the system, and it doesn't come across as as the author making something up. If it's the point of view character not fully understanding it and just relating it through their eyes. So that's kind of a cheat, but it's a useful cheat.
So that's how science fiction gets away with fantasy hand waving.
Exactly. You have to have Watson not understand what's going on and explain it that way.
Well, that's why I said that this, my first book was science fantasy, because it's got faster than light travel, and it's got some kind of inertia gravity control. It's just like, that's what it's got. I had to hand wave that stuff. The rest of it is pretty solid, gravity and terraforming and that kind of stuff. And the next book, which is near future, is kind of climate fiction. I consider that science fiction because it's based on science. I didn't have to hand wave anything in that case. So, and the book after that, the one that's coming out, is kind of an alt history replacing the Cold War with aliens. So I'm just hand waving all over the place in that one. So that's definitely science fantasy. And I find it, I find it hard to fathom that it's really just a matter of marketing. When it kind of comes to like such diverse voices as, Becky Chambers over here, who's got this beautiful character-driven, not a whole lot of plot, but beautiful characters and situations, kind of hand-wavy kind of stuff, and I would call that beautiful science fantasy. And then I look at Kim Stanley Robinson over here, who would be science fiction, but that's just my opinion.
Necessarily even all marketing as much as it's presentation is the way I describe it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can present something as marketing plays into it because everybody likes a clean genre because they know, I like science fiction, I like fantasy, I like romance, I like steampunk. And if you can do that, that's going to help you know how to market it and which Facebook groups to post to and which. So that's not nothing, but I think it comes down to presentation. Whereas we said that there are scientific ways, there are magical ways to look at science. There are scientific ways to look at magic. And I kind of did that when I had a sword and sorcery series. And these characters are, it's very Fritz Lieber, it's very old pulp. But sometimes when they stumble across the magic, they're like, well, why would that work? And they offer pseudo-scientific explanations of why things would work. And it's a kind of an understanding that the reader, being probably more versed in science, will maybe make some connections that, hey, maybe this isn't really magic. It's just technology they don't understand. And so I think you can come at it from that end, or you can come at it from, it's the Force, but we're going to hand wave, we're going to make up midichlorians because just the Force as a supernatural thing didn't work. It wasn't science fiction enough. So we're going to come up with some reason that is equally unfounded in anything. It's just, so I really think it's how we present it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right.
So what are we talking about here then?
Come up with something you can't see as an explanation.
Yeah.
Terry Pratchett does this to an extent in some of his stuff. I remember when he's talking about, and it's a minor subplot, but he's talking about germs. One of the characters doesn't want to go to hospitals. And he says, oh, I'm not worried about, I survived an attack by a banshee. I'm not worried about any of these doctors, fake invisible biting insects. He's talking about germs and it's germ theory.
Yeah.
And the reader knows it's germ theory, but to the characters, it sounds as unrealistic as dragons. They're actually less realistic because they've seen dragons, but they haven't seen these invisible biting creatures.
Well, let me throw this idea out. In a world where we are increasingly, and I'm a high school teacher, and one of the hardest things that teaching kids now is to tell the difference between opinion and fact, or fact and fiction, real news and fake news. Is it a good thing that the genres are beginning to blur in this way, or is it just symptomatic of our inability to tell real from unreal?
Or is it a response? Go on, Joyce.
I write YA for the most part, and in YA they just assume it's fantasy whether it's science fiction or not. I don't know why.
I often wonder if it's more a response just to authors increasingly needing to blur the lines a little bit when it comes to trying to stay ahead of technology. We all know it's advancing at a very rapid pace, and you, at any point when you're trying to explain a piece of tech, you are going to get to a point where you cannot, where our understanding fails, and maybe we'll get it at some point, but we're as authors, we're driven with that need to explain. And I just wonder that how much of it is that it's readers catching on to that is causing the lines to blur between them a bit, because that's as we were saying with fantasy, Brandon Sanderson is a prime example, of a hard magic system where he explains everything, but you eventually always get to a point where you're like, well, I can't explain. Like, even in my coherent, not made up magic system that I've got here, it gets to a point where I'm like, and magic did it, and I think it's at the end of the day, the two both have that fundamental flaw.
Yes, I think what Rob was saying there about the blurring inability of the incipient inability to tell the difference between fact and fiction and real from fantasy is kind of interesting, because it kind of chimes with the rise in science denial that we're getting, where people are looking at science and they're getting told scientific reasons for things. We've had several really good examples in recent years that, climate change is one, vaccinations another one. Really good, simple, or not simple, but there are scientific explanations for these things, but they're not simple. And people look at it and going, well, I don't understand it, therefore I'm just going to disregard it. There must be a better explanation than that. If you don't have a simple explanation for me, then science isn't real, kind of thing. So I think there's an element of people being forced to confront science and going, nope.
Challenge for us, for storytellers, because I think that one of the difficulties that a lot of science has is presentation, because they're very. I see this all the time in my job. Doctors will come in and they'll talk to a patient, and they talk to the patient like the patient is a second-year intern. The patient's getting none of it. I've gone in afterwards and I've said, so do you know what he said to you? So it's in science. That's why people like, for instance, Neil deGrasse Tyson or Carl Sagan in the past were really successful, because they were able to take science and make it feel more accessible. And I think that's something that we, as storytellers who write in somewhat in science, can try to do that. It's human beings like simple explanations, but simple explanations are usually wrong, or at least incomplete. Mm-hmm. I've said that if you can fit it on a bumper sticker, it's a bad idea. And that unfortunately, those are the ones that gain traction because they're nice and simple. But that's not all. That's usually not a good grasp of the situation, and I think we're struggling against that. And now, as you said, the climate denial is definitely a thing. The fact that there are actual flat earthers, that's even a thing. The fact that there's been this merging of, I don't think it's the science fiction and fantasy blur that's the great danger. I think it's the entertainment and news blur that's really dangerous.
I think it's probably, I think I agree with you to an extent, but I also think it's that it's what people are being taught. It's this is probably a little bit off topic here now I think about it, but in any book, it doesn't have to be science fiction or fantasy, you can have characters who are taught, who think critically about a subject, and you can try and get your readers to admire this and try and subliminally get them to approach this topic in the same way, in any topic in the same way, to think critically. And I don't think it's what you're thinking about. I think it's that message of critical thinking has been lost. And like I said, it could be in fantasy stories, it could be in science fiction stories. But I think that we as a human race are losing our ability to think critically. And that's the cause of the problem.
Con, you've been kind of quiet. What are you thinking here?
My mind's kind of spinning. No, I mean, I kind of agree that with Patrick's point earlier about the blurring of entertainment and news, and that's where the real slippery slope is, just as far as the way our society is moving. I think that the interest in stories that blur, what the ostensible topic of this panel is. I mean, it seems to me that there's more and more reader interest and viewer interest in stories that blur these genres that we're talking about. And I think that that's more a symptom of something rather than the cause of anything. But I don't have the words to kind of pinpoint what it is, like what it's indicative of. But there's some kind of, I'm gonna get a little woo here, sorry. But there's some kind of like psychological, emotional, spiritual something that's happening with humanity right now, obviously. And that the desire for these kinds of stories is rooted in whatever it is that's going on.
Is it looking for escapism?
Partly. Partly it's looking for escapism. Partly it's like this recognition of this path that we're on is not gonna cut it if we want to make it as a species. And I don't know, stories throughout human existence have been a way for us to figure ourselves out and figure society out. And so, yeah, so I'm sure there's an escapist element. There's certainly an escapist element to like my motive for writing the kind of stories that I'm currently writing, but I have other stuff I want to do eventually. I'm losing my train of thought, but yeah, I mean, stories have always been a way for society, for human society to figure itself out. So I definitely think that we're in the middle of trying to figure ourselves out, and part of the genre blurring too, or the interest in genre blurring stories, I think is driven by the rise of other media and the kind of delivery systems that the internet provides, streaming media, games, VR, emerging VR and AR means of delivering narrative. I mean, it's all kind of part and parcel of like whatever it is. So sorry if that's if I don't know.
No, I thought that was really interesting. I saw Joyce nodding too. Is there something you wanted to add, Joyce?
Mainly that where our society is going and how our society is sometimes confused about technology and sometimes confused about the news. And they're looking for explanations.
Well, some people, they take the fantasy as real. I mean, Harry Potter is they attempt to ban it fairly often because it has witches. They firmly believe in witches. So there's that category of people. And I wonder if that sickness of the soul that Khan is talking about is something we ought to think about as storytellers, or should we just try to market the hell out of it and try to get as much books published in that genre as we possibly can before the end hits?
I really loved hearing what Khan was talking about, and there's a flip side to what he was saying. You were saying you were writing escapism, and escapism is a reaction to what society is going through right now. And I was moderating a mental health panel 2 days ago. It was touching on a similar question, but from the flip side, it was authors who are writing about issues in response to their being in society. So it wasn't an escapism driving it, but again, it was how society is reflected in the change that we're seeing in the type of stories that are coming out. Particularly in that case, it was focused on mental health, but you see it across. You see it reflected in diversity, in sexuality issues. We're seeing just all stories. It's almost, I had this great quote at a convention I went to earlier, FantasyCon in the UK. And again, I'm terrible with names, so I cannot give the right credit to this person. But they said that basically that writing a book is you're taking part of the most long form of conversation that there has ever been. It's the longest running conversation. And just that's what literature is. It's authors talking to each other through the years. And I think that's a fantastic representation of society.
I'm in several writing groups, and one of them consists of women from all over the world. And they're all searching for a way to express how they're feeling about what's going on. And some are taking a science fiction or fantasy approach. Others are taking a more literary approach. But it's all for the same thing. It's to get out that those emotions that they have and their confusion.
I don't know if you guys remember the 70s at all, like the 1970s, but, post kind of Nixon and post, the 60s, there was this weird kind of turn away from politics, a weird kind of turn away from the real. And we were all like, self-exploring our bodies ourselves and the joy of sex. We were all like doing this kind of the hippie consciousness raising and this kind of stuff. Is that where we are now as a society? Is that something that we could, is that where our fantasy and because we are dealing a lot more with issues of gender identity and, that kind of thing now than we have before. We're looking more at representation. There's a lot more of that stuff in that kind of thing. So are we spending this time, this decade or two, just looking at ourselves and thinking about ourselves as opposed to looking at the future?
Patrick, I can't hear you.
Can hear you, Patrick.
Part of it.
I think people are certainly exploring these issues through fiction. I don't know that there's been a turning away from the world and a turning inwards, but I think there's been a tremendous change in a lot of social structures a lot of challenges to things that were seen as universal years ago. And it's happened fairly quickly. Over my lifetime, I've seen an enormous change in attitude, especially with regards to sexuality, with regards to gender, with regards to how we talk about that kind of thing. And it's going to provoke any challenge to an established status quo is going to provoke a backlash, and that's going to provoke this conversation. And I think that what's going on in society and what's going on in literature does have this push-pull back and forth. You can see it in music a lot, with what music deals with, whether it's dealing with simple interpersonal problems, and those are the popular things, whether it becomes really escapist. Like during the Cold War, we wrote silly songs because it was during the Cold War. Nobody dealt with anything serious. And then once the Cold War ended, music kind of took a more serious turn because it felt like it could grapple with the events that were around us then. As far as, and even in my writing, I wrote my military science fiction. I started it a long time ago. I wrote the first draft in the 90s, and then I put it aside, and then I came back and I revised it. I started writing the sequel. I thought it was a dystopian world that I was writing in. I was writing in what would have been a dystopian world in the 90s, early 2000s. When I went to write the sequel in like 2018, my dystopia was too hopeful. Like, the world around us is much worse than these characters. So my sequel crashed and burned. I couldn't write because I couldn't get my head around this being a hopeful. So the way things had changed and basic assumptions that were being questioned that seemed strange changed the whole way that was approached. So I think, and that's in a span of a couple decades. That's not over a generation or a century. So I think society definitely does have a big effect. The world and literature can't separate from one another. And that's why I think you have to kind of judge a literary work in the context of its time, because you can't extricate it.
Yeah. I started writing what I call a near future story. And as I'm writing it, the future is changing. And
I hate when that happens.
Yeah.
In terms of why we think it's happening, the question was like why we're almost becoming more, how we're responding as a society, maybe becoming more reflective internally about issues, and with looking at gender identity, that kind of thing. And I think I was watching, I hate to say it, I was watching TikTok videos the other day. I occasionally indulge, and I came to realize there's a large thing that social media and technology has done that has been changing society that we haven't really noticed. There's a few trends on these social media channels for people to analyze types of trauma that people have gone through themselves, and that, and stuff that never really got talked about. I saw one that was about intergenerational trauma. It was a really funny video, just about showing how, a mother who's taught to be strong and independent teaches her daughter to be strong and independent. It shows down the generation. And social media means that people can make videos about that, and suddenly people across the world can see that thing that never really got talked about. They can see that they can connect with it. And so I think that that's why we're starting to talk about a lot more of these issues, things that were hidden. I think social media the technology that has allowed that has been the driving force. We've had the news for years, but it's only been very recently that we have been having technology advancing us to the point where we can connect with anyone and everybody around the world. So I'd say that's the main driving force.
Mm.
Well, that in the future appears to be a little fucked at the moment. So maybe we don't want to look at it too closely.
Yeah. It's a bit hard to write a science fiction when you're thinking, oh, well, yeah, all my characters would have died in that apocalypse. Well, there you go.
Yep. It gets tough, to look at that near future and think about, like, what is that going to look like without doing that hand waving, without thinking like, maybe we have the technology to fix it, but do we have the will? Do we have the, so that's kind of the question. So.
Well, even in my escape, I keep using the term escapist to describe my story. feel
it's
like
a great story.
I may be selling myself short a little bit, but even in my escapist story, I mean, the background is that humans are in this part of the galaxy because they fled the Earth that they killed.
Yep.
So,
but that's also very hopeful. It's a hopeful aspect of that we got out, that it wasn't just Elon Musk living on Mars with his buddies, that it was, so there's a hope ingrained in that story that we managed to make it out. So thank you for giving us that hope, Con. If you haven't read the book, Circus Infinite, it's chef's kiss, beautiful book, a lot of fun to read, beautiful colors.
I've got it on my Kindle right now. Really looking forward to it. It sounds like
So much
exactly the
fun.
kind of escapism I need. And escapism isn't a dirty word, it's an important tool. It's an important thing that we all need a little bit of. The two things fiction can do for us at the moment are escapism and allowing us to examine the world around us. So I'm grateful for either of those. It does them well. So looking forward to it.
I got an audience question here about what can authors do to challenge or break down limited genre categories? Does anybody want to take a crack at it?
And do they want to?
Don't all jump in at once.
Keep doing what they're doing. Already we're seeing that's the origin of subgenre. It's when people do what they're like, no, I want to do this with a twist. I want to do something new. I see the evolution of genre as this really cool thing where I would love to go back and do an English degree, because I'm sure they must study this. Like someone must be studying this fascinating subject of how genre evolves over the years. And so, I think it's a natural process that will keep happening. And I think that, the rise of self-publishing means that maybe it's happening faster because suddenly there is a removal of gatekeepers. So there you go. More authors should self-publish if we want to break down the genre barriers faster, I guess.
That's a very good point. Because in traditional publishing, they want to pick a book that they know how to market, that they know that they can market. Oh, this is the next Harry Potter. We can market it in that. Whereas if you want to self-publish, you can straddle genres, you can bend them, you can leap back and forth. And I think some of the most iconic and most loved science fiction and fantasy tends to be the stuff that straddles the line. Doctor Who is not hard science fiction. There's a lot of fantasy elements in it. Star Wars, it's a lot of fantasy mixed in there. And so I think we just want, at the end of the day, people want stories that speak to them. And it's got to be a good story, and you have to care about the characters. And I think we challenge the rigid genre assumptions by just going where the story takes us.
The way I would kind of frame it is, we're talking earlier on about hand waving and not hand waving and making sure you get the details right. So the way I would frame it is, for whatever type of story you're going to write, make sure you get the details right in that area, but also just pump it full of imagination as well. The stuff that doesn't matter in terms of the mechanics of the story, pump it full of imagination and just let it fly. And that's the way you get those kind of accidental crossover type things.
One of my favorite examples of something that switched genres is Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern. The first book of that was fantasy until it became a series, and then it was rewritten into science fiction. It's still flying dragons, which is against the cube square, but beautiful books, and started one way and became the other.
I'm seeing more and more of mystery and history and all of these other genres being thrown in with science fiction or fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Yep, the Last Policeman by Ben Winters is one of my favorite trilogies. The guy trying to solve a mystery, whodunit, while an asteroid is coming to hit the Earth, and everybody wonders why bother finding out. So, great character study. That's
a really cool one. I love when I read The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, which is I'm not unsure what genre that falls into, but I was so gutted that the author didn't explore slightly more this body swapping, and that was the sci-fi nerd in me wanting more of that. And when, you know, the idea of asking for in a mystery, you know, what's the point, I'm like, that's yeah.
Beautiful stuff. Beautiful stuff. Well, we've got, you know, we don't have any more questions from the audience, and we've got about 5 minutes. We just got the 5-minute warning, so it's time to go around and, you know, if you have any parting shots or parting thoughts, or you want to flog your stuff again, this would be the time. We could start with Joyce. Didn't get a chance to flog, so
No.
Joyce, do you want to flog first?
Getting some out.
There you go.
Okay. This is the first book in my 4-book series called Crystal Odyssey. And it seems to be fantasy when it starts, but then there's science thrown in, but some of that science is questionable. And so take a look at these. They're all available on Amazon, and
is there an and, Joyce? Oh,
and I've got this one, which is A Bite of the Apple, and that won the New Mexico Press Women's Association Prize in 2016. I'm almost ready to publish the sequel to it, which will be called Winds of Change. And it has to do with portals and going through portals from one world to another. And
okay.
there's talk in it about the science behind the portals.
Cool. Patrick, do you want to go?
Yeah, I guess I could talk a little bit about my stuff and plug a little bit. I love to read across speculative fiction, so that's why I kind of can't nail myself down. So my first book was a urban fantasy, EMS themed, a character who's an immortal, who's able to heal people with some kind of supernatural power. But he's seen enough living through the ages that people don't react well to things they don't understand. So he hides out working as a paramedic because he can heal people before he knows how hurt they are, and use his gift a little bit. And that's written, the style, again, the style is detective noir kind of mystery, as he's trying to figure stuff out. It's definitely urban fantasy with no romance with vampires. So it's kind of a weird separate part of urban fantasy. Then I did my military science fiction because I wanted to play with my military background and put it in a near future thing, which again, I thought was a dystopia, but wound up being too hopeful. And then I went with a pulp sword and sorcery fantasy because I miss those. I miss the short little visceral pulps like that Carl Edward Wagner and Robert E. Howard and Fritz Lieber used to write. And then I figured, why do sequels when I could go in a totally different direction and do a, George McDonald Fraser, Flashman meets Cthulhu meets swashbuckling adventure, Jules Verne. And again, I figure if putting all the cool stuff from your childhood in a single thing worked for Lucas, I'm going to give it a shot.
Rachel, how about you?
Go on, I'll try and get them without just knocking something over. Yeah, if you want to find me on my YouTube channel, it's Science and Fantasy. If you're interested in my books, then you've got the Memory Thief series, which is Las Memoria and Scars of Cereba, which is asking the questions of, are you still you when you have your memories taken from you? So it's going into that new part of the Venn diagram that I'll have to figure out a name for. And then my other book is Saccarian Nights, which is a world of fungal darkness where it's just a horrid place that I've trapped my characters in, where there's fungi and spores everywhere, and it's it's a very gritty type of fantasy, so please don't be too disturbed.
Good times. Neil, how about you?
Yeah, one last time. The new book's called Queen of Clouds. It's about what happens when the weather becomes sentient and decides it hates everyone. There you go.
Great.
That sounds awesome.
Con, what do you got?
Well, my book is The Circus Infinite. I don't actually have a copy in hand's reach. Thank you, Rob, for running the pin. There's so my Twitter handle is in my name, and there's a link tree in my Twitter bio, and there's all the purchase links are there. I'd like to give a shout out to the readers who take a shot on the books that do what we're talking about, and the book bloggers especially. I mean, it's like right there the community that's driving this genre blurring and taking a shot on these books, and it's their interest that I think is making traditional publishers anyway, I mean, because self-publishers are just doing their thing, but I think it's the interest from these communities that are like letting traditional publishers know that there's interest and there's a market for these cases. So
They've just cut us off, so I think we're done. So, nice chatting with you guys.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very
Well,
much.
nice to talk to everybody.
It was lovely to meet you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
See you later.